Dawn breaks slowly over the Hürtgen Forest. Not with color, not with warmth, but with a gray, heavy silence that feels almost physical. The trees stand like dark pillars, packed so tightly that light struggles to slip between them. Frost clings to every branch. The ground is a carpet of pine needles, mud, and shattered wood. And somewhere beneath that quiet surface are the remnants of a battle few outside the front lines ever truly understood. To the men of the U.S. Army stepping into the Hürtgen in the fall of 1944, the forest looked like just another obstacle on the path to the Rhine. Another stretch of land to cross before winter. But within hours, it revealed itself as something entirely different, a place designed by nature and perfected by German engineers to break formations, distort plans, and consume whole units without ever giving the sense of progress. Fog covers the first patrols as they move in. Vision drops to mere meters. Every sound, a snapped branch, a shift in the wind, echoes like a warning. There are no open fields here, no clear angles to deploy armor, no room for maneuver. Instead, there is a maze, ravines slicing the terrain, steep slopes forcing single-file columns, and a canopy so thick that Allied air power, one of America's greatest strengths, becomes useless. For the men advancing that morning, maps feel like promises that reality refuses to keep. Trails marked as clear turn into dead ends. Enemy positions seem to vanish into the earth. And the forest itself, damp and cold, presses against every movement. Rifles jam. Radios lose range. Even the artillery, normally precise, becomes unpredictable as shells detonate against treetops, exploding downward in lethal bursts of steel and splintered wood. Within this suffocating terrain, the first American units begin to understand the truth. The Hürtgen is not simply a battlefield. It is an environment actively working against them. The Germans know every ridge, every bunker, every minefield. They've spent months preparing, carving out firing lanes invisible from the ground, laying tripwires in places no one expects, and turning logging paths into kill zones. And yet, the order stands. Advance. Push deeper. Break through the forest and secure the dams beyond it, the dams the American High Command believes could flood the Allied advance if left in German hands. But the men cannot see the dams. They cannot see the bigger picture. All they see is the forest. All they feel is the tension rising in the air as the fog thickens and the cold sinks deeper into their gear. By the end of that first morning, the U.S. forces will not have advanced far. But they will have learned something essential, something that will define the next months of fighting. In the Hürtgen, the enemy is not just the German army. The enemy is the forest itself. No one says it aloud yet, but the feeling spreads like cold smoke between the trees. This place is going to cost us more than anyone expects. By the time American troops reached the edge of the Hürtgen Forest in early September 1944, the strategic situation across Western Europe looked deceptively promising. The breakout from Normandy had turned into a rapid advance. Paris had fallen. Supply lines stretched, but momentum was unmistakably on the Allied side. Many soldiers believed the war might end before Christmas. But maps, especially in headquarters far from the front, have a way of simplifying things. To the planners in the higher echelons of the U.S. First Army, the Hürtgen was a dark shape along the German border, a patch of woodland sitting between the advancing American divisions and the Rohr River dams. Those dams, if opened by the Germans, could unleash water downstream and flood entire sectors of the Allied line, halting operations during the worst part of the winter. And so, the logic appeared sound. Secure the forest. Move toward the dams. Deny the enemy the chance to use water as a weapon. But the maps did not show the truth of the terrain. The steep gullies, the ravines, the narrow fire corridors carved by German engineers long before the Americans arrived. They did not convey the density of the pine canopy that blocked aerial reconnaissance, or the web of bunkers tied together by underground passages. And they certainly did not show the emotional weight of fighting inside a forest that swallowed sound, light, and orientation. American units entering the region had already been warned by the speed of the previous months. Many divisions had outrun their supply lines. Trucks carrying fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and winter gear struggled along muddy roads still recovering from the summer battles. Replacements, fresh, inexperienced, and often rushed through training, filled the gaps left by exhausted and wounded veterans. Meanwhile, on the other side, the German 275th and 353rd Infantry Divisions, along with specialized forest troops and remnants of battle-hardened units, prepared to fight from a terrain that favored every defender. They held the high ground. They knew the hidden trails. Their artillery observers were stationed in camouflaged towers that could not be spotted from the air. And their orders were simple. Bleed the Americans. Hold the forest as long as possible. Buy time for Germany's reserves. As September shifted into October, U.S. commanders believed the Hürtgen could be cleared in a matter of days. The intelligence reports were optimistic. The maps again looked manageable. The idea that a forest, not a city, not a mountain range, not an entrenched fortress, could delay the American army for months seemed unthinkable. Yet small clues began to surface. Patrols returning from the tree line reported that visibility fell to almost nothing inside the woods. Engineers discovered minefields layered in complex patterns, designed to slow every step. Artillery shells hung in the canopy before detonating, raining splinters downward with terrifying accuracy. And captured German soldiers warned, almost casually, that the Americans were stepping into a zone built to kill them. Still, the order remained. Advance. Secure the forest. Reach the dams. For the commanders, this was a tactical task. For the soldiers, it was something else entirely. The start of a struggle through darkness, cold, and confusion that would test every doctrine the U.S. Army believed in. The first serious assault into the Hürtgen was about to begin. And with it, the Americans would soon learn that the forest demanded a price far higher than anyone in the planning rooms had imagined. The first American assaults into the Hürtgen Forest began in early October 1944. On paper, the task seemed straightforward: push through several kilometers of woodland, seize key ridgelines, and break open the path toward the Roer River. But within minutes of crossing the tree line, the units involved realized they were entering not just a forest, but a battlefield shaped to punish every mistake. The first to feel the weight of the terrain were the men of the 9th Infantry Division. As they advanced, the forest absorbed their formation like a sponge. Columns that left the staging areas in neat order dissolved into scattered groups trying to navigate narrow trails. Radios crackled with static, signals faded in the damp air. The thick underbrush forced the men to move single file, rifles raised, unsure of what lay ahead. German defenses appeared almost without warning. Machine gun nests hidden behind layers of camouflage opened fire through pre-cleared shooting lanes. Mortar rounds crashed down with chilling precision, guided by observers who knew the forest's geography better than any map could convey. Each time the Americans tried to deploy heavy weapons, mortars, heavy machine guns, even small artillery pieces, the terrain pushed back, limiting angles, swallowing shock, and exposing crews to hidden fire. Then came the mines. Engineers who attempted to clear paths found themselves confronted by minefields laid with both discipline and cruelty. Anti-personnel mines mixed with anti-tank charges, booby traps wired to tree roots, and tripwires positioned at chest height for soldiers stumbling forward in the dim light. Every few minutes, a dull thud echoed through the woods, the unmistakable sound of a man stepping where he shouldn't. The forest amplified the fear. Visibility dropped to 10 meters, sometimes less. Each squad felt alone, convinced the enemy was everywhere. In reality, German forces were thinly spread, but the terrain multiplied their presence. A single machine gun team could hold off a company. A single mortar squad could pin down an entire battalion. American artillery, usually decisive, struggled to make an impact. The canopy robbed shells of their effectiveness. Instead of exploding on the ground, rounds burst in the branches above, showering troops with splinters of steel and wood. Even experienced infantrymen, hardened by Normandy and the push across France, found themselves unnerved by these tree bursts. The danger came from every direction, forward, backward, and above. Progress slowed to meters per hour. Squads advanced, took casualties, pulled back, tried again. And each time they moved, the Germans adjusted their fire, retreating just far enough to strike from another angle. Defensive positions were built into the terrain, reinforced by logs and earth, invisible until a muzzle flash betrayed them. By the end of the first week, the cost became impossible to ignore. Units that entered with full strength emerged with dozens of casualties. Platoons vanished into the fog and reappeared missing entire sections. Commanders tried to track their men, but the forest blurred the front line into a series of disconnected firefights. Still, higher command insisted on progress. The assumption remained that the German line could not hold long against American pressure. But pressure meant little in the Hürtgen. Every step forward felt like a step deeper into an environment perfectly designed to drain momentum, morale, and life. For the troops of the 9th Division, and for the divisions that would soon follow, the message was clear. The forest wasn't just slowing them down. It was controlling the rhythm of battle. And that rhythm was about to grow even deadlier. To the American infantry fighting inside the Hürtgen, German resistance often felt omnipresent, as if every tree concealed a rifleman and every ridge hid a bunker. But the truth was more precise, more engineered, and far more unsettling. German forces inside the forest were not numerous. What made them effective was the way they used the terrain and the time they had spent preparing it. German defenses in the Hürtgen were built around a simple reality. The forest did most of the work. Instead of massive fortifications or overwhelming manpower, they relied on a network of fighting positions carefully placed across key elevations, connected by communication trenches and hidden paths. Many bunkers were reinforced with layers of logs and earth, designed to survive artillery barrages. Others were so well camouflaged that advancing troops walked past them without seeing a thing, until a burst of automatic fire announced their mistake. The backbone of this system was the German doctrine of defensive elasticity. Units were trained to bend without breaking, to give up ground slowly, trading distance for delay. Every position was chosen not just for cover but for fields of fire, narrow channels cut through the trees that turned approach routes into lethal funnels. When American squads pushed forward, they often entered these corridors without knowing it, and once they did, the Germans triggered a coordinated response. Machine guns opening from two angles, mortars landing behind the attackers, and rifle fire guiding them back into the kill zone. Communication inside the German positions was shockingly efficient. Runners used concealed paths to relay information. Wires stretched between bunkers allowed instant targeting updates for artillery and mortars. Even when American units managed to silence a machine gun nest, another opened minutes later from a different ridgeline, often linked to the same observation post deep within the forest. Then there were the forest traps. Logs suspended by wires, ready to crash down when triggered. Rows of sharpened stakes hidden in underbrush. Explosives buried along trails the Americans assumed were safe. And, most dreaded of all, the S-mines, spring-loaded charges that jumped to waist height before exploding. In the confined paths of the Hürtgen, they were nearly impossible to avoid. German artillery, limited in number but expertly placed, amplified the chaos. Observers perched in trees or camouflaged towers had uninterrupted views of ravines and crossings. Once an American column entered these zones, the call went out, and shells began to fall with unnerving regularity. The forest canopy trapped the blasts, sending shockwaves downward, intensifying the fragmentation effect. Even shallow cover offered little protection. What made the German defense even more effective was something the Americans could not see: exhaustion and desperation. Many German units in the Hürtgen were under strength, made up of veterans mixed with young recruits. They lacked fuel, winter gear, and in many cases, food. Yet the forest gave them an advantage that compensated for every shortage. They could fight from positions that hid their weakness. They could force the Americans to attack at a disadvantage every single time. For the Germans, this was not a standalone battle. It was a delaying action, a calculated effort to buy time, to hold the line until new reserves could form, until the defense of the homeland could stabilize. And every hour the Americans spent in the Hürtgen was an hour closer to winter, an hour closer to the counteroffensive that would later erupt in the Ardennes. For the Americans, though, this distinction did not matter. All they felt was the resistance, consistent, organized, and invisible. By late October, U.S. commanders began to understand the scale of the problem. Their attacks were not collapsing because of lack of courage or firepower. They were collapsing because the forest had been turned into a designed battlefield, one where the defender dictated every engagement. And the deeper they pushed, the more they realized they were fighting on the enemy's terms, and losing ground with every gain. As October faded into November, the Hürtgen Forest grew harsher by the day. Rain soaked the ground until it turned into a thick, clinging mud that swallowed boots, stalled vehicles, and transformed every trail into a struggle. Nights dropped below freezing. Days brought wind that sliced straight through wet uniforms. And all of it, every drop of water, every breath of cold air, worked against the American infantry already fighting uphill, both literally and figuratively. Logistics, usually the backbone of American strength, began to fracture under the forest's pressure. The narrow trails that served as supply routes were barely wide enough for single-file movement. Trucks could not pass. Jeeps bogged down. Mules were brought in, but even they struggled on the steep, slippery slopes. Ammunition had to be carried in on foot, packed in crates that weighed heavily on exhausted soldiers. Hot meals were rare. Dry rations became the norm. Water, ironically, was hard to distribute, as streams were contaminated and purification tablets ran short. And then there was the mud, not just an inconvenience, but a constant enemy. It coated rifles, jammed bolts, and rendered machine guns unreliable. Mortars misfired. Radios clogged with moisture and pine needles. Even maps, essential for navigating the maze, tore apart in soldiers' hands or turned to pulp in jacket pockets. The forest didn't just slow movement, it degraded equipment, morale, and the will to keep advancing. The cold brought new problems. Frozen hands fumbled with ammunition. Feet remained wet for days, leading to trench foot that swelled skin into painful, blistered masses. Soldiers huddled in shallow foxholes that filled with icy water. Ponchos, helmets, and canvas all became slick and useless in the freezing rain. Many later recalled that the forest drained warmth from the body the way it drained light from the sky. The wounded suffered the most. Evacuation was slow and dangerous. Stretcher teams moved through narrow, twisting paths under constant threat of mortar fire. A single evacuation could take hours. Medics fought to keep men alive long enough to reach aid stations, but many died simply because the terrain refused to let them leave quickly. Meanwhile, German forces, though also suffering, were dug into fortified positions with overhead cover, dry storage for ammunition, and pre-stocked supplies. Their advantage grew with each passing day. American artillery tried to break the stalemate, but poor visibility and inaccurate maps led to misalignment. Rounds often detonated prematurely in the canopy, showering friendly troops with deadly fragments. Soldiers soon learned to fear the sound of their own shells just as much as enemy fire. In some units, fatigue reached a point where orders had to be repeated multiple times for men to react. Eyes dulled. Movements slowed. Officers noted that soldiers walked like sleepwalkers, awake, but barely present. The line between caution and numbness blurred, leading to fatal mistakes in a forest where hesitation could cost a life. As winter approached, the psychological weight grew heavier. Men felt trapped between the trees, unable to see the sky, unable to judge distance or direction. The constant dampness, the muted light, the smell of pine and mud, it all blended into a monotone environment that made time lose meaning. Days felt the same. Nights felt endless. By mid-November, one thing had become painfully clear. The forest was grinding the American army down faster than any German counterattack could. And yet, the order still stood. Keep advancing. Push deeper. Secure the forest. Even as the cost rose, the mission remained unchanged. By mid-November, the pressure on American commanders inside the Hürtgen Forest had reached a breaking point. Reports from the front lines were grim. Heavy casualties, limited progress, exhausted troops, and a terrain that nullified nearly every advantage the U.S. Army typically relied on. Yet, at higher headquarters, the situation still seemed manageable, at least on paper. The truth was more complicated. Communication between frontline units and command posts was unreliable at best. Radio transmissions broke up in the dense forest, and wire lines were constantly severed by shellfire or falling branches. Orders often arrived late, distorted, or missing critical details. In some cases, units attacked without knowing neighboring battalions had been delayed or repulsed. More than once, entire companies found themselves advancing alone, believing support was on the way when, in reality, it had never left its starting position. The planning assumptions made before the operation had also proven dangerously optimistic. Commanders underestimated the strength and preparedness of the German defenses. They expected a traditional retreat, a collapse under pressure, not a disciplined, layered resistance. Intelligence reports failed to capture the complexity of the terrain, the depth of the fortifications, and the German ability to reinforce positions using concealed forest paths. Instead of re-evaluating the mission, many headquarters simply reassigned new units into the same problem, expecting fresh troops to succeed where others had been broken by the terrain. Divisions rotated in and out, but the forest remained the same, swallowing each attempt with the same quiet, brutal efficiency. Coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery collapsed almost entirely. Tanks, restricted to narrow trails, could rarely deploy where infantry needed them. Artillery, firing blind into the woods, risked hitting friendly forces. Air support, one of America's greatest assets, was nearly useless. The canopy shielded German positions from observation, and fog often grounded the aircraft entirely. Some officers on the ground began to question the mission's value. They argued that the forest offered little tactical advantage and that bypassing it might be a better option. But at higher levels, the fear of the Rohr River dams, still seen as a potential threat to future offensives, kept the pressure on. The belief that clearing the forest was essential had hardened into a strategic assumption. This gap between reality and planning fueled frustration among frontline commanders. They spoke of unclear objectives, shifting priorities, and inadequate maps. They complained that their reports were softened or lost as they moved upward through the chain. And they sensed that those making decisions simply did not understand what fighting inside the Hürtgen truly meant. Stories spread among the troops about orders repeated again and again: take the ridge, secure the crossroads, advance another kilometer, as if the terrain didn't fight them every step. Soldiers joked bitterly that the planners must have imagined the forest as a park, not a battlefield engineered to kill them. But beneath the humor was anger. Anger at being sent into an environment they didn't control. Anger at losing friends for a hill that seemed insignificant. Anger at decisions made far from the rain, the mud, and the cracking branches overhead. By the third week of November, the confusion had become systemic. Units were misaligned. Objectives were unclear. Command posts shifted locations so often that some runners couldn't find them. And the Germans, aware of the disorganization, adjusted their defenses to exploit every mistake. The forest was no longer just a physical obstacle. It had become a wedge driven between the men who fought and the men who commanded them. And that fracture was about to cost even more lives. As the fighting dragged deeper into November, the battles inside the Hürtgen Forest shifted from cautious movement and scattered firefights to something far more violent and intimate. The terrain forced it. The visibility demanded it. And the Germans, knowing every rise and hollow, manipulated it. The forest compressed the battlefield into narrow encounters where soldiers were often so close that they could hear the enemy whispering, adjusting equipment, or reloading. Machine gun fire came from angles impossible to anticipate. Mortars landed without warning, their explosions muffled by the trees until the blast was already on top of the men. Squads advanced from tree to tree, stopping every few steps to listen. Really listen, because in the Hürtgen, sound mattered more than sight. A soft click might signal a tripwire. A metallic rattle might reveal a machine gun team adjusting position. The Germans took advantage of this. They waited in silence, letting American patrols move deeper into carefully prepared pockets before opening fire from multiple directions. For many infantrymen, the fights became a blur of shouting, splintered wood, mud flying from shell impacts, and flashes of muzzle fire in the darkness. Grenades were used constantly, tossed into dugouts, ravines, and shadowed corners where rifles couldn't reach. At such close range, soldiers didn't have time to aim. They reacted instinctively, firing at movement, sound, or silhouettes that vanished as soon as they appeared. It wasn't uncommon for patrols to crawl over the bodies of fallen comrades without realizing it. The forest hid everything: enemy positions, friendly positions, and the dead. Men reported hearing groans in the night, but unable to find the wounded. Others described the haunting silence after an ambush, broken only by the dripping of water from branches above. Bayonet fighting, rare in most late war battles, reappeared inside the Hürtgen. When two squads stumbled into each other at close range, rifles were too long and grenades too risky. Fights erupted in the dark between trees, chaotic and fast. Exhaustion and fear made them unpredictable. Veterans later admitted that these close encounters stayed with them longer than any artillery barrage or long-range firefight. German forces used the forest to control tempo. They attacked suddenly, then vanished. They placed snipers in high branches, nearly invisible against the darkness of the canopy. They rigged abandoned positions with traps to punish any American attempt to take ground. The goal was always the same: slow the advance, inflict casualties, disappear. But American soldiers adapted. Platoons learned to move in tighter formations, covering angles instinctively. They marked cleared trails with shredded cloth or scratched symbols into tree trunks. They listened for changes in the forest's background noise: a dropped rifle clip, a snapped twig, even the soft click of a safety being released. And slowly, painfully, they pushed forward. Still, every meter cost lives. At times, the fighting grew so close that soldiers threw back German grenades before they detonated. Other times, the forest itself seemed to betray them. Tree bursts rained splinters that cut into skin like knives. Roots tripped men at the worst possible moments. A fallen branch could reveal a position or block a retreat. Despite the chaos, one fact became clear: the Hürtgen wasn't allowing either side to fight the way they preferred. The Americans couldn't use mobility or fire superiority. The Germans couldn't rely on open terrain or long-range shooting. Instead, both armies were dragged into a primitive, grinding contest where survival depended on split-second decisions and raw endurance. By late November, these close fights had taken a toll that statistics didn't fully capture. Men were sleeping in shifts, shaking from adrenaline or cold, jumping at every crack of wood. Some whispered that the forest itself was alive, watching them. Others stopped talking altogether, operating on instinct alone. This was no longer a series of tactical engagements. It was a fight for every inch, one where the line between attacker and defender blurred into a struggle between men and the relentless, unforgiving terrain around them. And the worst was still ahead. If there was one element of the Hürtgen Forest that every American soldier feared, even more than hidden bunkers or sniper fire, it was the artillery. Not because the Germans fired more shells than usual, but because of the way the forest transformed each explosion into something far more lethal. In open terrain, artillery kills with fragmentation that spreads outward across the ground. In the Hürtgen, the story was different. The dense canopy of branches acted like a trigger. Many shells never reached the soil. Instead, they struck the upper limbs of pine and fir trees, detonating instantly and turning the entire tree into a weapon. Soldiers called these explosions tree bursts. A tree burst didn't just create shrapnel. It sent downward a rain of jagged wooden splinters, shards that tore into skin, muscles, and bone with terrifying force. The men described them as wooden daggers, long, sharp, and unpredictable. The explosion came from above, striking from an angle for which foxholes and helmets offered little protection. The sound was unmistakable: a crack, a rolling thump, and then a storm of debris whipping downward like a hail of knives. Veterans later said that even hearing artillery above the treetops made their stomachs tighten. They knew what was coming. And they knew they had nowhere to hide. Trying to dig deeper offered only limited help. The forest floor was riddled with roots that made excavation slow and painful. Many soldiers fought from shallow depressions or small holes barely large enough to fit a curled-up body. Even when they managed to dig proper foxholes, a tree burst could still send splinters straight down into their positions. German artillery observers, positioned in high towers or camouflaged platforms, knew exactly how to exploit this. They watched American movements along trails and ridges, called in fire missions with precise coordinates, and then adjusted as the shells struck above their target. Their accuracy improved over time. Their timing became faster. And in the forest, even a single well-placed barrage could devastate an entire company. To the infantry below, the forest amplified the effect. Each blast echoed between the trunks, making it impossible to tell direction. The canopy caught fragments and redirected them unpredictably. Smoke hung in the air, mixing with fog, making visibility even worse than usual. And the psychological weight grew heavier with every strike. Some soldiers began to speak of the trees as enemies, silent, towering forms that waited for the next explosion. Many later admitted that their nightmares were filled not with images of German soldiers, but with the sight of branches snapping overhead, releasing fragments of wood and metal that spun downward like shrapnel from the sky. The danger wasn't limited to German shells. Even American artillery sometimes triggered the same effect, exploding prematurely in the branches and sending debris onto friendly positions. Units learned to brace whenever they heard their own guns fire, unsure if the support would help them or harm them. The combination of terrain, weather, and precise German coordination turned artillery into one of the deadliest forces in the Hürtgen. It struck men who thought they were in cover. It disrupted attacks before they began. It shattered morale as effectively as it shattered trees. By late November, commanders on the ground understood that artillery alone could halt an advance. They watched entire waves of infantry stall under a single barrage. Men scattered for cover, only to find none. Radios went silent. Plans dissolved. And the forest, already claustrophobic, became a cage where every sound above the canopy meant danger. For many soldiers, the memory of those tree bursts never faded. They could still feel the sting of bark hitting skin, hear the whistle of fragments slicing downward, and see the sky turn into a ceiling of fire and falling wood. In the Hürtgen, artillery didn't just wound. It took control of the battlefield, from above. By late November, the American advance in the Hürtgen Forest had slowed to a crawl. The maps at headquarters showed lines creeping forward, sometimes a few hundred yards at a time, sometimes less. But the reality on the ground was far more brutal. Every inch gained felt like it had been paid for with lives, energy, and whatever remained of the soldiers' resilience. Units that began the campaign at full strength were now shadows of themselves. A rifle company that should have fielded 180 men often had fewer than 80 still able to fight. Platoons operated with half their usual numbers. Some squads, theoretically composed of 12 soldiers, marched into battle with 4 or 5, and still received orders to push forward. The replacements arriving at the front were young, inexperienced, and shaken the moment they stepped into the trees. They wore clean uniforms and carried fresh gear, but they lacked the instincts of men who had survived the forest's ambushes, mines, and artillery. Veterans tried to guide them, but the learning curve was unforgiving. Many replacements were wounded or killed within hours of joining their units. Others froze under fire, unable to react fast enough in an environment where hesitation could be fatal. For the officers, the situation was just as grim. Company commanders were wounded or killed so frequently that promotions happened almost overnight. Lieutenants took over for captains. Sergeants took over for lieutenants. And when sergeants fell, leadership shifted to whoever was still standing. The chain of command grew thin. Decisions that should have been coordinated were made in seconds, under fire, by men who had never expected to lead. The constant strain eroded discipline in subtle ways. Soldiers moved slower. They took longer to respond to orders. Some walked forward with empty expressions, focusing only on the next tree, the next ridge, the next trail that needed to be cleared. Others developed a grim routine: advance, dig, endure. The hope of getting out of the forest, alive, became more important than any tactical objective. Sleep became rare. Men collapsed in foxholes, still gripping their rifles. They woke at the slightest sound or didn't wake at all until someone shook them. The cold pierced deeper each night, and the forest floor offered no comfort. Some soldiers slept sitting up, afraid that lying down meant not waking again. Medical personnel reported cases of exhaustion so severe that men fell asleep during artillery barrages. Meanwhile, the German defenders, equally strained but fighting from fortified positions, used the Americans' slow pace to their advantage. They shifted troops to threatened areas, counterattacked small gains, and slipped away just before being overrun. Each time American forces captured a bunker or clearing, another defensive position waited farther ahead. Progress became a cruel illusion. Maps labeled small advances as accomplishments, but the men on the ground felt none of it. The forest looked the same in every direction. Every ridge seemed identical. The sense of movement vanished, replaced by a feeling of being stuck in one endless, unforgiving landscape. Morale fractured. Some soldiers grew irritable, snapping at each other over trivial things. Others withdrew into silence, speaking only when necessary. Chaplains described men confessing not guilt, but fear of dying unseen, in a forest where even recovery of the dead was often impossible. And yet, despite everything, the orders remained unchanged. Advance. Push deeper. Take the next objective. What no one outside the forest seemed to fully grasp was that the Hürtgen was consuming the fighting power of entire divisions. Not through dramatic battles or sweeping offensives, but through a relentless grind of weather, terrain, fatigue, and the slow, steady attrition of human limits. The forest wasn't just resisting the Americans. It was wearing them down in ways no map could show, and no plan had accounted for. For weeks, American commanders believed that taking the towns of Wassenack and Schmidt would finally break the stalemate in the Hürtgen. These positions sat on higher ground, controlling the vital roads and trails leading deeper toward the Rohr River dams. If the Americans secured them, they could roll up German defenses and open the path to the east. On paper, it made sense. But once again, the forest had other plans. The attack that would become one of the most painful chapters of the entire campaign began in early November with the deployment of the 28th Infantry Division, a National Guard unit from Pennsylvania that had already endured heavy fighting in France. Many of its soldiers were tough, experienced men, but they were about to enter the most unforgiving terrain they had ever seen. The plan was straightforward. One regiment would seize Wassenack, or another would push down the Kahl Trail toward Schmidt. Engineers would keep the supply route open. Once Schmidt was secured, armor and reinforcements would follow. But from the first hour, things unraveled. American troops advancing toward Wassenack came under fire from German artillery observers positioned on unseen ridges. Shells crashed down with such precision that some companies barely left their starting positions before taking casualties. Still, through sheer determination, they managed to push into the town. But holding it was an entirely different challenge. Wassenack lay on exposed high ground, a perfect target for German guns across the valley. Men dug in as deep as they could, but the ground was rocky, the cold numbing, and the explosions relentless. Some soldiers later described the ridge as a place where the earth never stopped shaking. Meanwhile, the push toward Schmidt became a nightmare. The Kahl Trail, the narrow supply route chosen for the advance, turned out to be little more than a muddy footpath carved into steep hillsides. Jeeps slid off the edges. Tanks bogged down in the muck. Engineers tried to reinforce the trail, but German artillery zeroed in on any construction attempt. Mule teams struggled to move even a fraction of the needed supplies. Yet, against the odds, the 112th Infantry Regiment reached Schmidt, fought its way in, and for a brief moment, held it. But the position was exposed on all sides. German forces regrouped quickly, including elements of the 116th Panzer Division and elite infantry units experienced in forest combat. At dawn the next day, they counterattacked with overwhelming force, tanks, infantry, and artillery striking simultaneously from multiple directions. The Americans in Schmidt had little cover, few anti-tank weapons, and almost no communication with higher headquarters. When German armor broke into the town, the defenders were forced to retreat the same way they had come, back up the Kahl Trail. But the trail was already under heavy fire. Some men slipped into ravines while trying to flee. Others were cut down by machine guns as they tried to cross open patches of ground. Entire platoons dissolved during the retreat. By midday, the American foothold in Schmidt had collapsed completely. On the ridge at Wassenack, things were no better. German counterattacks slammed into exhausted U.S. units. Fog and smoke made coordination nearly impossible. At one point, a battalion holding the ridge fell into disarray after its commander was wounded. Confusion spread. Positions shifted. Lines became disorganized. German artillery pounded every attempt to regroup. Reinforcements tried desperately to push forward, but the forest and the enemy pressed back with equal intensity. The Col trail was now blocked by wrecked vehicles and fallen trees. Medics struggled to reach the wounded. Runners carrying messages disappeared into the fog and didn't return. It was the breaking point. The attempt to take Wassenack and Schmidt didn't just fail. It shattered units, drained morale, and exposed how deeply the forest dictated the battle. Historians would later call it one of the costliest single actions for U.S. forces in the entire European theater. By the end of the operation, the 28th Division was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. It had done everything asked of it, and more, but the cost was unbearable. And still, the Hürtgen was not finished with the Americans. After the collapse at Schmidt and the brutal fighting across Wassenack Ridge, the American infantry in the Hürtgen Forest entered a stage of exhaustion unlike anything most of them had ever experienced. These were men who had already fought through Normandy, crossed France, and survived the Siegfried Line. They knew hardship, hunger, and fear. But the Hürtgen introduced something new, a kind of slow, grinding erosion of the mind. By late November, many units could barely function in a coordinated way. Soldiers moved through the forest with hollow eyes, their faces coated in mud and days-old stubble, their uniforms stiff with dried rain and sweat. They walked hunched, as if the weight of their gear and the forest itself pressed down on their shoulders. Some carried rifles mechanically, without checking the chamber or the sights. Others didn't speak at all unless directly asked. Medics reported rising cases of combat fatigue, what today would be recognized as PTSD and acute traumatic stress. Men trembled uncontrollably after artillery barrages. Some refused to leave their foxholes. Others wandered aimlessly until officers physically pulled them back. Fragmented sleep and constant cold amplified the psychological strain. Every night blended into the next, each filled with the same sounds: distant gunfire, falling branches, the low rumble of artillery echoing through the trees. One officer later wrote, "The forest didn't kill all of us. It just took pieces, a bit of strength here, a bit of courage there, until we weren't the same men anymore." Malnutrition became common. Rations arrived irregularly, often soaked through or frozen solid. Soldiers ate them anyway, tearing into cans with numb hands, barely tasting the food. Some went days with only a few bites. Water was harder to manage. Canteens froze, and streams were unsafe. Dehydration hit many without them realizing it. The wounded suffered the most. Evacuating injured men through the twisting, narrow trails was almost impossible. Stretcher teams slipped in the mud, struggled up steep ravines, and navigated through areas still under fire. Casualties sometimes spent hours exposed to cold rain before reaching aid stations. Medics fought to keep shock victims warm, covering them with blankets and jackets, but the forest drained heat quickly, and many didn't survive the journey. Morale slipped into something darker. Rumors spread that divisions were being sacrificed, that commanders didn't care, that no one outside the woods understood what was happening. Soldiers wrote fewer letters home. Some stopped writing altogether. Chaplains became one of the few stable sources of comfort, listening to confessions, doubts, and quiet pleas for strength. Replacements arrived, fresh-faced and nervous. They stepped into the line and immediately sensed the atmosphere. The way veterans scanned tree lines obsessively, the way conversations were short and practical, the way every sound caused men to flinch. Within days, the replacements looked no different from the others. The forest aged them quickly. There were moments of quiet, but they didn't bring relief. Silence in the Hürtgen meant danger, not rest. Men lay awake, listening for movement, for the crack of a twig, for the distant rumble of tracks they couldn't see. Many later said the nights were worse than the fighting, because at least during combat, adrenaline gave them purpose. In the dark, they had only their thoughts and the shadows between the trees. Despite everything, they continued to fight. Not out of confidence or enthusiasm, but because there was no other choice. Orders were orders. The mission remained the same. And each man relied on the one beside him, the buddy system, the quiet trust formed in foxholes and under fire. That connection was often the only thing keeping them moving. By the end of November, some American divisions in the Hürtgen were operating at a fraction of their original strength. Officers found themselves commanding companies with the manpower of a single platoon. Entire battalions rotated out only to discover they had lost more men to cold, illness, and fatigue than to enemy fire. The forest hadn't broken them with a single blow. It had worn them down layer by layer, stripping away comfort, energy, and hope until only raw determination remained. And winter was only beginning. By early December, winter arrived in full force, tightening its grip around the Hürtgen Forest and turning an already merciless battlefield into a frozen labyrinth. The cold that had been creeping in for weeks finally settled like a weight on every branch, every foxhole, every soldier still standing along the shattered American lines. Snow fell in uneven sheets, sometimes lightly, sometimes in blinding swirls that made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. It covered shell craters, disguised mines, and muffled the sound of footsteps. The forest, once muddy and damp, became white, brittle, and silent, a silence that felt almost unnatural, as if the entire landscape was holding its breath. For the soldiers who had survived the autumn campaign, winter brought a new set of challenges. Their wet uniforms stiffened in the freezing air. Boots turned rigid. Gloves, when available, soaked through quickly and offered little protection. Frostbite spread through the ranks, first numbing toes and fingers, then turning them black if untreated. Medics worked constantly, trying to save limbs as well as lives. Weapons suffered as well. Rifle bolts froze. Machine guns jammed unless they were handled with painstaking care. Metal parts stuck to bare skin. Mortars became unreliable, their tubes chilled by the wind and moisture. The cold affected everything: trigger fingers, breathing, even the speed at which soldiers could react. Foxholes, never comfortable, now filled with snow and ice. Men slept in them curled tightly, sharing body heat, waking with frost on their eyebrows and mustaches. Some tried to light small fires, but the smoke drew attention, and embers risked igniting dry pine needles. Most chose to endure the cold rather than risk a mortar round homing in on their position. Visibility changed dramatically. The dense fog of autumn gave way to a thin, pale haze broken by streaks of white and the occasional flicker of movement between the trees. Snow absorbed sound, making it harder for soldiers to detect patrols or approaching enemy units. At the same time, tracks in the snow revealed movement instantly, making concealment almost impossible. German forces, though suffering from the same brutal conditions, held a crucial advantage. Their defensive positions were already established. Their bunkers were reinforced and partially insulated. Their supply caches were prepared well before winter's arrival. And many of their soldiers had experience fighting in cold weather conditions from the Eastern Front. Americans, by contrast, were constantly moving, attacking, retreating, shifting positions, rarely staying long enough to build any meaningful shelter. And even when they tried, the frozen ground fought every shovel strike. Digging a new foxhole could take hours. Some men resorted to using explosives to break the earth, which risked revealing their location. The psychological impact of winter was profound. The forest, already claustrophobic, now felt suffocating. The contrast between dark trunks and white snow created disorienting patterns that confused depth perception. Soldiers reported seeing phantoms between the trees, not hallucinations, but shapes formed by branches, shadows, and falling snow. In the half-light of early morning, it was impossible to tell friend from foe. Winter also isolated units even more. Patrols that ventured out at night sometimes lost their bearings and never returned. Radio equipment failed when batteries froze. Runners struggled through drifts that reached up to their knees, their breath steaming in the air as they pushed against the cold. More than once, bodies were found days later, lying in the snow as if they had simply fallen asleep. Logistics, already strained, nearly collapsed. Supplies froze in trucks, fuel thickened, and food became difficult to distribute. Medical teams ran low on plasma and blankets. Some soldiers resorted to heating rations with small chemical packets meant for other purposes. Others ate them frozen, gnawing through meat and vegetables as if chewing ice. And yet, through all this, the fighting continued. German artillery still pounded American positions. Mortar teams adjusted for snow density, calculating how shells would behave in the changing environment. Snipers took advantage of clear winter mornings when the air was sharp and still. The forest did not rest. It simply changed weapons. By mid-December, the Americans understood that winter had not paused the battle, it had reshaped it. The Hürtgen that had bled them in the fall was now tightening its grip, sealing every path, hiding every threat beneath a layer of ice and snow. And deeper in the German lines, preparations were underway for something larger, something that would soon erupt just beyond the southern edge of the forest. But for now, in the Hürtgen, winter ruled everything. By mid-December, the American push in the Hürtgen Forest had become something almost mechanical, a cycle of reorganizing, advancing a short distance, taking casualties, pulling units back, then trying again with whatever strength remained. The commanders on the ground understood the cost. The soldiers understood it even better. But the mission still stood: gain ground, secure the ridges, keep pressure on the German line. The priority now was simply holding units together. Divisions battered by weeks of fighting were patched up with replacements who barely had time to learn their squadmates' names. Some rifle companies, reduced to a fraction of their original size, were reorganized on paper just to maintain structure. Commanders issued new rosters as often as they issued new orders. A platoon leader might start the week with 30 men and end it with 10, and still be expected to maintain momentum. Despite everything, the Americans did adapt. Officers adjusted tactics for the forest's limitations. Instead of broad advances, units moved in smaller groups, clearing sectors slowly and deliberately. Fire teams learned to mark cleared areas with cloth strips or broken branches to prevent friendly fire. Engineers moved cautiously, probing for mines with bayonets and listening for tripwires in the snow. Every step forward required patience and steady nerves. Artillery coordination improved. Instead of large barrages, American batteries fired short, precise missions to neutralize specific bunkers or suspected German positions. Forward observers crawled onto ridges under fire to get clearer views, relaying coordinates through radios that barely functioned in the cold. It wasn't perfect, but it offered some relief to infantry who had grown accustomed to feeling isolated. One important change was the careful use of armor. Tank crews understood that the forest was dangerous ground. Narrow trails, steep embankments, and hidden mines made every movement risky. But when tanks were deployed at the right moments, supporting infantry along key logging roads, they helped break German strongpoints that had resisted for days. Even a single Sherman appearing at the edge of a clearing could shift the momentum of a fight. Still, progress remained painfully slow. A day's objective might be a single farmhouse, a cluster of ruined bunkers, or a rise in the terrain barely visible beneath the snow. Soldiers measured success not in kilometers but in how many trees we passed. And even small advances required endurance and determination. German forces, though battered as well, refused to yield easily. Their positions grew thinner, but they fought with the discipline of defensive veterans. A bunker abandoned in the morning might be reoccupied by afternoon. Snipers shifted positions regularly. Mortar crews fired quickly and then relocated before American counterfire could find them. To many Americans, it felt like fighting a ghost, an enemy who appeared suddenly, struck hard, and then vanished into the trees. The forest amplified this sense of invisibility. A squad might advance for an hour without seeing a single German, only to walk into a deadly ambush triggered by a tripwire or a burst of machine gun fire from a camouflaged trench. The terrain provided endless hiding spots for defenders, and no amount of caution could eliminate the risk entirely. But the Americans pressed forward anyway. Not because they believed victory was close, but because momentum, even slow momentum, mattered. High Command wanted the forest cleared before the new year. They wanted the path to the Ruhr River secured. They wanted the pressure maintained so German forces could not regroup. This persistence had a cost. Casualty reports grew longer by the day. Supplies thinned. Medical teams were stretched to their limits. Some companies entered battles already knowing they would be short on ammunition before the fight ended. And yet, there was a silent determination among the men. They had come too far to stop. They had lost too many to turn back. The forest had taken lives, strength, and hope, but not resolve. Not yet. Through snowstorms, through freezing nights, through the endless repetition of advancing and digging, the Americans kept pushing. And with each step, the German line weakened, not dramatically, not suddenly, but slowly, like pressure building against a dam. What no one in the Hürtgen knew was that another storm, far larger than anything the forest could produce, was gathering just beyond their southern flank. But in these final days of the battle, the focus remained the same. Hold the line together. Advance where possible. Endure everything else. As American units fought their way through the last weeks of the Hürtgen campaign, they remained largely unaware of what was happening just outside their field of vision. Their world had shrunk to the forest, the next foxhole, the next ridge, the next cold meal. But behind the scenes, a far larger picture was forming, one that would soon reshape the entire Western Front. High Command believed the Germans were on the edge of collapse. After months of retreat across France and Belgium, it seemed logical to assume that German forces were too exhausted, too under-equipped, and too fractured to mount any serious counteroffensive. The Hürtgen campaign was seen as part of the final tightening of pressure, one more advance before the push toward the Rhine. But the reality inside Germany was very different. Deep in the Eifel region, south of the Hürtgen Forest, German planners were preparing for a massive strike, an operation bold enough to rival anything attempted since the early days of the war. It would be launched through the Ardennes, an area the Allies considered unsuitable for large-scale offensive action. German intelligence recognized that the Americans had scattered units thinly across the sector, assuming the terrain offered natural protection. What the Americans didn't realize was that the Hürtgen fighting had indirectly helped create those vulnerabilities. Divisions that might have reinforced the Ardennes were tied up in the forest. Others had been so severely weakened by weeks of grinding combat that they could no longer serve as effective reserves. Equipment, ammunition, and manpower had been consumed at staggering rates, all for incremental gains measured in yards. The forest had drained American strength, quietly, steadily, and at precisely the moment German planners needed it most. Even as U.S. forces pushed through snow-covered ridges and fortified positions in early December, German units moved into assembly areas under strict radio silence. Tanks rolled through forests at night. Assault troops drilled in secluded glades. Fuel and ammunition were stockpiled in barns and tunnels. The entire operation, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, was building like a storm gathering behind the distant line of trees. Some officers on the American side sensed something was wrong. Intelligence reports mentioned unusual German movements. Pilots flying reconnaissance missions reported signs of armored concentrations. A few frontline commanders noted the surprising resilience of German defenders, wondering if they were part of something larger. But in the Hürtgen, the immediate fight overshadowed everything else. The forest consumed attention, energy, and perspective. Days and nights blended into one long struggle. When you were fighting for the next tree, it was difficult to imagine divisions of tanks massing miles away. Meanwhile, the Germans used the forest's brutality to their advantage. Delaying actions in the Hürtgen kept American units pinned down. They forced reinforcements, artillery, and supplies to flow into a region that offered little strategic value, except for the fact that it drained Allied strength at a critical moment. The American soldiers on the ground felt none of this. They weren't thinking about the Ardennes. They were thinking about staying alive, keeping warm, and getting through the next firefight. Their focus was so narrowed that even when commanders mentioned possible German activity to the south, it felt distant and abstract, irrelevant compared to the cold rifle in their hands and the pine shadows ahead. But the connection was undeniable. The Hürtgen Forest had become a vacuum, pulling American resources inward just as the German counteroffensive was preparing to burst outward. In a matter of days, the front would explode into chaos. Divisions that had barely survived the Hürtgen would be thrown into a new battle, one larger, faster, and far more unpredictable. For now, though, the men in the Hürtgen still believed they were fighting the same fight they had been fighting for weeks. They had no idea that the forest, in its terrible grinding way, had helped set the stage for the biggest surprise attack the Americans would face in Europe. By mid-December 1944, after weeks of bitter fighting, American forces finally began to emerge from the Hürtgen Forest. They hadn't taken the forest in a dramatic sweep. They hadn't broken the German line in any decisive moment. Instead, they had pushed the defenders back ridge by ridge, bunker by bunker, tree line by tree line, a slow, grinding advance that measured success in yards and measured cost in lives. When the last significant pockets of German resistance withdrew toward the Ruhr River, the forest did not feel conquered. It felt survived. Units that stepped out of the Hürtgen looked nothing like the ones that had entered it. A division that should have fielded 15,000 men sometimes marched out with fewer than 9,000 still effective. Rifle companies were reduced to handfuls of exhausted survivors. Leaders who had carried their units through Normandy and the Siegfried Line were gone, wounded, killed, or replaced by younger officers who had aged years in a matter of weeks. For many soldiers, leaving the forest felt surreal. Open sky seemed unnatural. Roads looked too wide. Buildings felt strange after so many nights spent under pine branches and snow. The silence of the Hürtgen had conditioned them. Even distant artillery outside the forest sounded different, less muffled, less intimate. Men blinked in the winter light, as though stepping out of a cave. Officers took stock of what remained. Equipment lists were a catalogue of loss. Missing rifles, destroyed mortars, burned-out tanks, vehicles abandoned along frozen trails. Aid stations overflowed with men suffering from frostbite, trench foot, respiratory illness, and exhaustion so severe that some collapsed as soon as they sat down. But the psychological toll was harder to measure. Some soldiers spoke softly, answering questions with nods instead of words. Others kept their gaze fixed on the ground, as if the forest was still beneath their feet. A few sat alone, not from lack of camaraderie but because they simply had nothing left to give. Chaplains and medics recognized the deeper wounds, the tremors, the 1,000-yard stares, the sudden flinches at snapping branches or falling snow. One NCO described the experience simply. "We came out of the forest as different men. Some came out alive, some didn't. But none of us came out whole." When the fighting finally ceased in the Hürtgen sector, commanders compiled the casualty reports. The numbers were shocking even to them. Tens of thousands of Americans had been killed, wounded, captured, or incapacitated by cold and illness. Entire battalions had been rebuilt 2 or 3 times. The forest had consumed manpower at a rate comparable to the worst battles of the war, but without the sweeping movements or strategic clarity usually associated with such losses. And then came the cruel irony. Many of the divisions pulled from the Hürtgen, exhausted, understaffed, low on ammunition and winter gear, were immediately redirected to confront the German counteroffensive erupting in the Ardennes. There was no meaningful rest. No chance to recover. Some men fought their way out of the Hürtgen only to march directly into another winter battle. The forest had not just drained American strength. It had emptied units at the exact moment they were needed most. Even so, the campaign ended with a sense of quiet resilience. The Americans had endured one of the harshest battlefields in Europe and had fought through a terrain designed to defeat them at every turn. They had taken the objectives assigned, even if those objectives proved less valuable than originally believed. And through sheer persistence, not speed, not maneuver, but persistence, they had emerged on the other side. But as soldiers looked back at the dark tree line fading behind them, few felt any sense of victory. The Hürtgen did not inspire triumph. It inspired reflection, and, for many, a lifelong attempt to understand why they had been asked to fight there for so long. The forest stayed with them, not as a place on a map, but as a memory etched into bone and breath. In the months that followed the fighting, as American armies pushed across the Rhine and deeper into Germany, commanders and historians began to assess the Hürtgen campaign with clearer eyes. Away from the mud, the mines, and the shattered trees, the battle looked different. The fog of war lifted, and what emerged was a hard truth. The Hürtgen had exposed deep flaws in planning, coordination, and strategic judgment. For many officers, the first lesson was painfully obvious. Terrain matters more than maps. On paper, the Hürtgen looked like a minor obstacle, a patch of woods that could be cleared with determination and manpower. In reality, it was one of the most defensible pieces of terrain in Western Europe. The steep ravines, dense pines, narrow trails, and limited visibility neutralized American strengths and amplified German ones. The U.S. Army, built for mobility, firepower, and combined arms coordination, found itself forced into a static, infantry-heavy fight it was never designed to win cheaply. A second lesson was equally important: never underestimate a prepared defender. German forces in the Hürtgen were not elite. Many divisions were under strength, some composed of young recruits or older men. But they had time to dig, time to reinforce, time to study every ridge and draw. Their bunkers were placed with mathematical precision. Their mines were layered to channel movement. Their artillery observers knew exactly where American troops would appear before they appeared. The forest allowed a weaker force to fight like a stronger one. The third lesson cut deeper. Objectives must match reality, not expectation. The initial assumption that the Rohr River dams had to be taken through the Hürtgen was later challenged. Alternate routes existed. The forest could have been bypassed. Resources committed to its capture might have been used more effectively elsewhere. Some commanders later admitted that the stubborn push into the woods reflected inertia more than strategic necessity. Once the operation had started, it felt harder to stop than to continue, even as casualties soared. Another critical lesson emerged about inter-branch coordination. The Hürtgen revealed how difficult it was for infantry, armor, artillery, and engineering units to synchronize in restrictive terrain. Tanks could not maneuver. Artillery struggled with canopy bursts. Engineers were overwhelmed by mines. Communication lines broke under constant shell fire. Air support, usually decisive, became irrelevant. It was a rare environment where nearly every branch of the U.S. Army operated with reduced effectiveness. Instructors at staff colleges would later study the Hürtgen as a case study in the limits of combined arms, a reminder that doctrine, no matter how refined, must adapt to terrain, weather, and enemy preparation. But the most enduring lesson, perhaps, was human rather than tactical. The Hürtgen showed the cost of attrition warfare in a modern army. The willingness of American soldiers to endure hardship, fight through fear, and keep advancing was undeniable. But their sacrifice was magnified by decisions made far from the front, decisions shaped by imperfect intelligence, overconfidence, and assumptions that did not match the battlefield's reality. Veterans who survived the forest often said the same thing in different words. "We fought hard. But we shouldn't have had to fight that way." The campaign became a quiet warning, a reminder that even a powerful army can bleed heavily when terrain and tactics collide. It warned against underestimating minor objectives. It highlighted the need for flexibility, for listening to frontline reports, and for shifting strategy when the cost becomes disproportionate to the gain. And it underscored a truth that would echo through future conflicts. Environment is not neutral. It is a force, one that can shape battles as decisively as armies. In the end, the Hürtgen was not a defeat. The Americans accomplished their mission. But it was not a victory in the traditional sense either. It was a lesson carved into the landscape and into the memory of every soldier who walked out of those trees. A lesson written in frost, mud, and silence. Today, the Hürtgen Forest is quiet again. The snow melts in spring. Pines sway gently in the wind. Hikers walk the same ridgelines where entire divisions once bled for every step. Birds nest in the branches where artillery shells used to detonate. And the ravines that echoed with machine gun fire now fill with the soft sound of running water. To an untrained eye, it looks peaceful, ordinary even. But for those who study the war, and especially for those who survived it, the Hürtgen carries a weight that has never fully faded. This was not a famous battle like Normandy, or dramatic like Bastogne, or decisive like the crossing of the Rhine. The Hürtgen didn't produce iconic photographs or clear symbols of victory. It produced, instead, a long chain of small fights, each one fought in the shadows, each one costing too much for the little ground gained. And maybe that is why the memory lingers so powerfully. The forest represents the side of war that rarely fits into neat narratives, the slow, grinding, unforgiving side where strategy meets the harsh limits of reality, and where success is measured not by sweeping advances, but by endurance. For the soldiers who fought there, the Hürtgen was not a single moment. It was weeks of cold, hunger, exhaustion, fear, and determination. It was the stubborn belief that they had to keep moving because stopping meant ceding the initiative, or losing the man next to them. It was the sound of branches breaking overhead, the thump of artillery hidden by fog, and the feeling of being trapped in a place that felt as hostile as the enemy itself. And yet, they fought through it. They didn't quit. Even when they were under strength, undersupplied, and under the worst conditions imaginable, they continued the mission. Historians still debate the strategic value of the battle. Some argue it should never have been fought. Others say it was a necessary step toward securing the Ruhr River and blocking the German defenses. But on one point, nearly everyone agrees: the cost was unparalleled for the gains achieved. The forest taught lessons about terrain, planning, intelligence, and the limits of doctrine. But it also revealed something fundamental about the human element of war: the capacity to endure, to adapt, and to push forward even when everything seems to be pushing back. Small memorials now stand at the edges of the Hürtgen. Simple markers. Names carved into stone. Crosses and stars placed where units once dug in. Many of the men who fell there were never recovered. The forest took them, and the forest kept them. But their stories survive through letters, diaries, official reports, and the memories of those who walked out alive. The Hürtgen Forest is still a forest, but it is also a reminder, a living archive of endurance and sacrifice. A place where the past sits just beneath the surface, waiting to be noticed by anyone willing to look closely. And so, when we speak about this battle, we remember more than strategy. We remember the men who stepped into the trees, fought in the cold, held their ground against an enemy they often couldn't see, and came out changed forever. The forest is quiet now, but it hasn't forgotten, and neither should we.